Great, thank you. All right, so I'm actually going to kind of talk first and just kind of set up the outline for what we're going to do. And then Vicki is going to finish by applying some of the things that I talk about to the case of Hungary and her experience there. Again, the idea and the goal behind this webinar is not to necessarily discuss and to repeat a lot of statistical data, but is to give a general overview of kind of what this problem is looking like, what is kind of the limited knowledge base that we have now, what does that say? And then obviously Vicki is going to provide some more specific details with Hungary, but then we're hoping to really spend the remaining part of our time kind of having a discussion and kind of getting some feedback on what people think of this issue. That is something that we're very much going to look forward to. So I'm going to move quickly into the next slide. And Vicki, also just to let you know, will also be introducing herself when it's her time to talk. So on this slide, I have put together 3 studies that are very recent, that are studies that I was actually reading for a different project. But I noticed that in these 3 studies, a repeated theme was this idea that more NGOs were commenting that there was an increased number of boys being prostituted or being sexually exploited. Even though the statistical data, it's very far-reaching and it ranges. For example, the first document that's listed by the ECPAT, if you go to their website, which I've provided for you in a reference list that I believe is on the Child Protection website, on the website for the webinar, there are country reports. There's a general summary report, but then there are specific country reports. And I went through every report that's written in English, and there is a wide range of statistics from NGOs reporting that somehow they think there's an increase, but it's very difficult for them to define exactly what that increase is. Eurostat, which is the other document that's on this slide, also has data, as you can see, from 2010 to 2012 that indicates a very small, it's small, but still an increase. And obviously the statistical data, even though it's a little bit unreliable because different people are going to measure this issue in different ways, it's also measured in different countries using different systems. I think it's also most likely measured very sporadically, which means that we only get these very, very limited snapshots of what the statistical quantitative situation actually looks like. And that doesn't mean that this data is not helpful. It just means that we have to be very careful how we interpret it. A great example is the second study, the Center for the Study of Democracy, Child Trafficking Among Vulnerable Roma Communities. This is a great study. It's provided on the list, which Evgenia has commented is there. Thank you, Evgenia. This study is very interesting. If you read the results, particularly related to Bulgaria, which I've read, the qualitative research in this study and some of the casework study that they do reflects that this issue is a very serious issue in the Roma community. But then if you read the next document, the UNODC document, you get kind of, I would say, a more relaxed and a more toned down impression of what this problem is. For example, they cite the UNODC document cites data saying that there's only been a very, very small increase in the number of boys that are being sexually exploited in Bulgaria. And the numbers are very minimal. For example, somehow in 2010, the Bulgarian government has commented that only 1 boy was actually sexually exploited that year. But again, if you read this document that's just a couple years later, the situation looks much more desperate and looks much more intense. And so, when you look at the scope of the problem, that right there, just that is kind of an indicator that we definitely have a problem, but it's a little bit unclear to what extent and to how far-reaching it is. So this was, when I started reading these statistics and these reports, I really became interested in wanting to look at this problem more and to just get an idea of, what is the hub doing and what are people that are involved in the hub, what other people are engaged in this issue and what are they seeing? And so, again, in this slide, I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but you can just see when you look at those documents that there is an indication that at least this idea, if it may not be getting worse, but it's at least getting a lot more of a notice. And based on the unclear statistical data, I think in particular, the research knowledge right now that we have on this issue is kind of indicative, or it shows four different kind of challenges and four different aspects of this. The first one is that we continue to have a significant lack of research on this topic. And I don't mean necessarily technical research like best therapy approaches or best clinical ways to approach this population. That is also a problem. But I mean, just in general, we have a really difficult time even understanding the different features of this population, meaning who are these boys that are being sexually exploited. And so I think that significant lack of research is really difficult because it makes it hard for us to kind of move forward. Moving to the second issue, one of the reasons why we are having trouble reaching such kind of an underground population is it has been proposed in several of the documents that I have provided in this list that especially in Western Europe, where there is a sexual demand for same-sex sexual favors, even though there's a demand for this kind of sexual favor, there's still a lot of stigma attached to asking for that, which means that it drives a lot of these sexual favors underground, meaning that it's not as obvious as perhaps a lot more kind of female-driven or female sexual favor demand. And so when you have a population that is so marginalized and vulnerable, and then they are channeled into an activity that has a lot of stigma, it drives it even further underground. And this means that it's much harder for NGO workers, especially for academics, for law enforcement, for people working in child protection. It's much, much harder for us to reach this population. This has actually been commented on in the academic literature. There's an article that it's an academic article, it's provided in the list. It's the article that was released in 2008 on male prostitution. And the author of this article actually makes the argument to an extent that because female sexual exploitation, the exploitation of girls included, is much more recognized and much more prevalent, it's much easier for people to engage this population and to try to assist them. Whereas the situation with boys is much more challenging. It's much more difficult. It takes much more effort and much more time. And so that makes it difficult for us to gather reliable information. The third comment about children and teenagers being less likely to identify, this is a barrier that's well recognized in the child trafficking reports, literature, so I won't comment on that too long, but it is true that children are less likely to report as victims, and so that also can be a barrier, especially with, for example, law enforcement is traditionally not very attuned, or they typically are not trained to recognize this issue. And then finally, again, the argument that is used as a reason why we have not been able to develop research the way that we should be able to is, again, the idea that female victims typically get the majority of the attention, and obviously they deserve attention. And so the idea of this webinar is not to necessarily take away attention from female victims of trafficking, regardless of their age, but more to draw attention to male victims of trafficking, in particular boys, because they just, again, are a very overlooked and equally vulnerable population. So with women continuing to get a lot of attention, it tends to detract a certain amount from boys. So that kind of, the idea of these slides was just to kind of set up some of the broad themes of the literature. It's actually difficult to find academic literature on the topic of male prostitution and boys prostitution. There is some, but it's far less than what is, because research typically, again, focuses on female prostitution and female sexual exploitation. With that, we want to turn to Hungary, so I'm going to let Vicki comment and she can introduce herself and then she can talk about her experience in Hungary.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. So my name is Victoria Sephei and I'm from Hungary. I'm actually a sociologist and I'm doing my PhD as well. I'm doing research, or I have conducted research since 2009 on trafficking, and I did almost 20 research on trafficking. The focus of my interest is mostly child prostitution or sexually abused children. And I have participated in the Central European University's research on sexual exploitation of boy children. The research was called Countering New Forms of Roma Children Trafficking. It was a participatory approach and it was called Confront shortly. And we finished it actually last year. In Hungary, I have worked for the Central European University Center for Policy Studies. The research was conducted by 7 partner institutions in 7 countries, and there were sending countries and receiving countries in terms of victims. The aim and scope of the research were, we have looked at policies concerning human trafficking and the factors that lead to victimization, and we were curious how the recruitment works to trafficking. So we were basically curious about the mechanism of child trafficking. We focused on bagging, pickpocketing, and sexual exploitation of boys. I have to admit now that we couldn't only examine boys' sexual exploitation. We also had to focus on girls to understand more the phenomenon. So we had research questions, and they were the following. Who are the main victims of child trafficking? What are the main factors that lead to victimization of children? What does the child protection system do to protect vulnerable children? What happens if they do not protect or they do not identify children? The focus was on Roma victims, because the presumption of the research was that Romas are more overrepresented among the victims, but we have to emphasize that we saw that trafficking is not an ethnic problem, it's rather a poverty issue. So we had to examine Roma people, but it was the main focus, but we didn't think that it's a ethnic problem. So the methodology of the research was on national level, we have examined the local level institutions, those institutions who are dealing with the victims and the child victims who are meeting them, or they should meet in their everyday work, and they were the child and family welfare centers, foster homes, police, civil and Roma organizations. The community members they are basically meaning the victims and the informants who are living in the environment of the victims. I also have to mention that the policy framework based on the EU Directive 2011/36 on human trafficking, and the focus of the research, or the whole policy framework, was based on that. This is a binding legislation in the whole EU. And the main focus is the purpose of exploitation in human trafficking crimes and the following punishable acts. You can see it on the list: the recruitment, the transportation, transfer, harboring, or reception of persons, including the exchange or transfer of control over those persons. I'm not going to read you the whole list because I think you can check it, or I'm sure that most of you are aware of this legislation. But what is really important that when we are talking about children, that when the victim is a child, a person below 18 years old, these acts of exploitation are automatically deemed to be a crime of trafficking. Doesn't matter if the child is agreed to do the exploitation or not. We also examined how Hungary implemented this directive, and we were checking or analyzed the legislation, the effective legislation, and we were analyzing the new criminal code, and it came to effect in July of 2013. And there is a new definition on trafficking in human beings. And what is really important then that the previous criminal code did not include the exploitation term, and it emphasized more the selling and buying of people, what was really problematic. And unfortunately, in the new legislation, it's still there. It's still emphasized. And what we have seen during the research, that the professionals working with victims, they still think that the main character of human trafficking is, or how they can see victims, that they were sold and they are purchasing people. The new law still does not include the terms of forced prostitution, forced labor, child prostitution, or explicitly the sexual exploitation term. What is really an important change in the new criminal code is that children who commit certain crimes can be punished with imprisonment in Hungary from age 12. The other very important is that children who are in prostitution commit a petty offense or misdemeanor, they can be sanctioned with prison as well. I tell you numbers. In 2014, 272 children were fined for prostitution in Hungary, and 53 of them were imprisoned. I'm sure that we can agree in this, that this is really heavy, that instead of giving them support and aid and everything what they need requires, instead of this, the Hungarian government decided to fine and punish them. In 2015, the numbers who were imprisoned, like children who were imprisoned, it's still a high number, but in percentage it went to 10% of cases who were sanctioned for prison and who were under 18. It's still a huge percentage. A sexually exploited child, according to laws, can be a perpetrator and victim in the same time, and not clear who is who and when is who the victim. Yes, the profile of the victims, this was our main, we wanted to see more on that. And we could see that the children, the victims are the children who are coming from poverty, impoverished families and neighborhoods. We have also seen that criminalization within the family or in the community puts children at risk. We interviewed a lot of child victims, and they talked about family members who were in prison, and they were talking about it very naturally. They are socialized to this thing, and these children were exploited from a very young age. We have also seen that dysfunctional families, the victims are coming from dysfunctional families, and we can also see that they suffer from child abuse, and we can also see that the substance use of their family members and actually of their substance use is transparent. We have also seen that that a lot of trafficking is happening when the children are the runaway children and they are escaping from foster care. Boy victims, it's a Latin phenomenon, and I think that the role of men and women in the society contribute to victimization and re-victimization as well. When we did interviews with professionals, we could hear, or we could see that that boy children, they don't ask for help and they feel shame to ask for help, and plus they are not aware of their rights. That's another question, but I think role of men and women contribute to the victimization. The next slide, I talk about the deficiencies of the referral and assistance system, about child protection system. In Hungary, the child welfare services, they do very little in real terms to prevent victimization of children. First of all, they cannot identify who are the victims of children. They don't have proper answers, and unfortunately, there is no protocol in the system, so professionals are left alone. I think we have to emphasize that because there is no protocol exists in the system on victimization, the picture of the victim is put on the professional. It's depending on him. In general approach, victims have to suffer physically and emotionally, or they have to show somehow the signs of suffer. This is in the picture of this is what the professionals said, that they recognize victims like this if they suffer. And what we know about trauma literature, that the key of survive in different kind of abuses, if children are not showing or victims do not show their suffer. So the concept of the victims among professionals is really not good, and it doesn't help victims to be recognized as victims. What is really also important, that professionals often see child prostitution is a voluntary act by the child and not a coercion or abuse. We have heard from a lot of professionals, and they did not even feel shame to say that sexual exploitation is part of the Roma culture, and Roma people do not mind exploitation because it belongs to their culture. It was really surprising that they were talking about it. What is really important, that talk about foster care. We have seen that a lot of the victims come from foster care, or they are in foster care. I also conducted a research in 2012 with the involvement of 120 women who were in prostitution, and 30% of them, they were raised in foster care in Hungary. The foster care do not contribute to victimization, but they do not do against victimization, so they contribute to re-victimization of children. The next slide, I will talk about the assistance of child victims. We have analyzed the referral mechanism. There is a victim assistance service in Hungary, and it's available to victims of all kind of crimes. they are not specialized to assist victims of trafficking at all, and they are not specialized to assist child or children. We could see that there is no specialized care available for child victims. We also examined victim identification. We could see that there are no protocols, they cannot recognize child abuse, etc. I was talking about it before. Victim assistance. We could see that if a child accidentally identified as a THB victim, human trafficking victim, that the government or the child protection system member, they just cannot give her or him any assistance because there is no special institution for THB victims. And there are a few places in shelters, and the shelters is only concerned for adult victims and those children who belong to their mom or dad who became adult. It means that if someone become a child victim or sexually exploited, the system just, if she or he will be recognized as a victim, they will just go back to the foster care where she was before. So no special assistance for child victim of trafficking is available. And we also have to mention, or we have to talk about police. And I'm sure that most of you have experience working with police. That can be that can be a challenge. We could see that police is aware of prostitution or sexual exploitation of children. Police cannot identify as other members of a child protection system. They are actually member of child protection system, and they just cannot identify victims. By the way, I'm doing research I mentioned in the beginning, and there are interview questions that I'm asking from every victims who I'm interviewing with or from. And I used to ask if they meet police during their exploitation, and the answer is most of the time yes, they meet police, and police is just not helping them. So in the police there is no investigation without reporting the case, and police often exploiters child victims of exploitation. Police often exploit child victims as well. We have also heard that there is a term for that within the police, but this is not proved scientifically. So why doesn't the child protection referral work when child trafficking is suspected? There is attitude problems, and I talked about it before, that it considered as a voluntary act. They are not aware of what coercion means or exploitation means. Child prostitution is not treated as endangerment of a child, and it's not easy to prove. And the victims are just not treated as victims. There are deficiencies in the law enforcement, what we have seen in the research. I have already talked about police, and I also mentioned the new legislation that children can be imprisoned as a sanction for prostitution, and I also told you the numbers. And the problem with this as well, that those children who are actually victims of trafficking, and we consider every children who are under 18 and they are in prostitution, they are sexually exploited as victims, but police see them as perpetrators, and that's a big problem in the system. And they also consider children under 14. So there are really there is a lot of problem with the police in terms of protection and support. In the poor and segregated neighborhoods, we could see that no persecution of criminals although everybody is aware who they are, who the drug dealers are, and so on. Police corruption I'm not going to talk about. I'm sure you have heard of this. What is really serious that police do not start the investigation if the case is not reported by the victim, and this is in contradiction with the EU directive. In most cases of trafficking in human beings, the charge is not THB but something else, and it has a less severe sentence in Hungary. I'm telling you another number I have examined in the statistics, and last year, according to the criminal statistics in Hungary, the number of sexual exploitation cases were 1015, while cases of trafficking in human beings, they were only 23. Okay, I told about it that THB is still understood in local levels as selling and buying people for money. Okay, another very important statement that according to the EU directive and also the Hungarian criminal code as well, victims of exploitation could not be convicted if they committed crime while being trafficked. But because there is no identification that they are victims, police will never recognize that they were forced to do criminal activities, and a lot of time they are involved in other criminal or multiple criminal activities. So we could see that there are very few cases go to the court because most of the procedures are stopping during the investigation phases. The judicial process is problematic because the child victims are at the same time witnesses, and they have to meet several times with the accused during the procedures, even though if they are children, and only indirect evidences are available, but the court does not take them into consideration. By the way, victims do not go to the police to report their case, and I think knowing the legislation, we can understand why. So the summary, we could see that boy prostitution is an extremely latent phenomenon. More and more children are victimized in forms of child trafficking. In my presentation, I was told to ask about sexual exploitation and not other crimes, but to be honest, during our research, we could collect most of the information on sexual exploitation of boys and girls as well. So the other phenomenons like pickpocketing and child begging are more hidden. The child protection is actually not prepared to prevent victimization, identify victims, and assist victims. Children are re-victimized, and we could really see during the analysis that none of the institutions are specialized for child victims of trafficking. There are lack of institutional, legal, and financial support, and of course, governmental will is missing to fight against human trafficking. So, yeah, I was asked to explain latent. Is it for me? Latent means that we cannot see; it's a hidden phenomenon. And I can see another question that what about other countries? To be honest, I was involved in the Hungarian research, but you can read the other country reports. They are really interesting. I could only talk about briefly, but I think maybe it's more interesting for you if you read it. And what I'm really curious about, I could see in the beginning that you have you are coming from areas of child protection, and can you please talk about if you have experience working with traumatized children? How the system deals with trauma? Do you have this concept? Do you talk about it in the child protection system? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victoria and Michelle. Wonderful presentation. I think, Victoria, we had one more question that, let me read it for you. The fact that you did not find boy victims, does it mean this is an even more hidden phenomenon?
Yes, there are a lot more. Actually, we have found a lot of boy victims, but we could see that the society or the child protection system members, they are a little bit more aware of victim, like a girl victim, and I think that this is the result of the work of the women rights NGOs. We can see more and more the phenomenon of girl and women prostitution. But I can see that if we are looking for boy prostitution, child sexual exploitation, we can have a lot. We can have, unfortunately, a lot of cases who won't be ever considered as victims.
I think too.
Thank you very
if
much,
I could just make. Oh, sorry, Evgeny. Can I just make one comment? Is that okay? Awesome. Thank you. I just wanted to comment that for anyone who's listening, who is interested in trying to get kind of a better understanding of what this problem looks like in other countries. I mean, I understand that in this part of the world, in Southeastern Europe, since these are countries that are supplying the boys, the best reports to read, I think, are actually the reports that come from Western Europe, because that's where the NGO sector and law enforcement and those kinds of systems are forced to really kind of respond and to interact. So that doesn't mean that the information that is coming out of Southeastern Europe is not useful. It is useful, but I feel like usually that information describes the source of the problem. But when it comes to learning about the implications and kind of the impact and the results of what starts in Southeastern Europe, particularly the country reports on different Western European countries where the demand is, can be very useful. So I would definitely recommend, if you start with the ECPAT website, and if you look at the country reports, I would highly recommend looking at like countries like, for example, Germany has a pretty extensive report where they have a number of different studies. And I would also recommend looking at Italy. Italy also has a fairly extensive report, and then obviously the Netherlands and Norway actually have reports where there have honestly just been more studies have been produced where they have attempted to try to estimate what the scope of this problem is. For example, there are reports from Germany from 5 years ago that talk about foreign unaccompanied minors, and most of them being boys. And so this was a problem that was recognized 5 years ago, way before the refugee crisis set in. And so some of these reports may be useful to people that, for example, we have several people that are active in this population that are working with refugees. I would recommend just scanning those reports to see what sources they cite, because they may be able to lead to different NGOs or different researchers that are active in this area and can provide kind of more current and just more recent data. It's just a suggestion. With regard to adding the reports, some of them actually I think possibly are already connected to the Child Protection Hub. I can check and see. There are so many of them, though. It would mean, literally probably connecting 30 or perhaps more reports. But that's why I actually just recommended going to the ECPAT website, because they're just all right there. And there's different versions of these reports, because they always usually provide like a summary that's very brief, maybe 1 or 2 pages. And then some of the countries actually may provide additional information. And so for that reason, it just seemed easier to send people directly to the ECPAT website. The executive summary for ECPAT on this topic, I believe, is actually already on the Child Protection website. I would have to check, but I think it's there. And then also too, for anyone that is maybe perhaps less familiar with the Child Protection Hub website, you would want to go to childhub.org, so childhub.org. You have different options when you get to the main page of the site, and you can either go through an online library, you'll see that as an option, or probably the faster option is just to use the search function. And you can put in these titles or put in the topic, and the website, the Child Protection Hub website, can show what is available. Thanks, Evgenia.
Thank you very much, Michelle. If any of the participants have any further questions, please feel free to use the chat box. Meanwhile, I would like to ask you to evaluate the webinar. You see the poll on your screens right now, unless you haven't done so yet. Also, as you know, we issue certificates of attendance, so if you want to have one confirming your participation in this webinar, please email us at this email address. I just sent you the address in the chat, info@childhope.org. And also please keep an eye on our future upcoming webinars. The next one we are going to have on the 7th of April, and it's going to be about online tools for rights-based advocates. If we don't have any further questions, then I would like to thank you, Michelle and Victoria, very much for your wonderful presentation, and I wish you all a nice day. Thank you.